Welcome to Beyond They Called Us Enemy. I'm Ann Roll. I'm the Associate Dean for Collections and Scholarly Communications at Pollock Library. I'm also here in my capacity as chair of the One Book, One CSUF Planning Committee. And we're happy to have this as our first event of the One Book year in conjunction with Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity programs, as well as the Asian American Pacific Islander Faculty and Staff Association. And with that, I pass the mic to Dr. Eriko Self.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Eriko Self. So I'm the co-president of Asian American Pacific Islander Faculty and Staff Association. I'm so excited about this event and all the speakers. Now I want to introduce your moderator today, Dr. Karen Yonemoto from Asian American Studies.
Thank you all for being here today. At the dawn of the year 2020, an outbreak of a novel coronavirus known as COVID-19 rapidly spread nationwide, manifesting in a global pandemic. When the United States declared COVID-19 a national state of emergency, fears of the American public escalated, and labels such as the Chinese virus, Kung flu, Wuhan virus, as well as other racial quips associated with disease, triggered a resurgence of anti-Asian sentiment and a rise in reports of anti-Asian hate incidences and anti-Asian hate crimes. The book, They Called Us Enemy, reminds us that anti-Asian sentiment in the US is not new. From the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the violence targeted toward South Asian Americans and others during 9/11, to the present-day pandemic, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II is a reminder of the long history of racism and discrimination embedded in our nation's fabric. This year's One Book, One CSUF selection is a memoir based on the life of George Takei, who, for those who are familiar with American popular culture, may recognize as the actor who portrayed the character Hikaru Sulu in the television series Star Trek. The book tells of the disruption of the Takei family when U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in 1942, mandating all persons of Japanese ancestry to systematically relocate to concentration camps across arid deserts and barren swamplands in the American West and Southwest. They Called Us Enemy is among one of the first graphic genres to feature Japanese American characters and a storyline rooted in Japanese American history. The book illustrations help us to reimagine the shared living spaces inside the barracks, the communal mess halls, alternative bath facilities using old coffee cans, and the nuances of everyday camp life through the eyes of a Japanese American child. We become drawn into the arduous train ride from California to Arizona, the formidable heat when Takei's father opens the door at the post on barrack for the first time, and the difficult decision George Takei's parents made to answer no and no to the loyalty questions and the heavy militarization in Thule Lake. The graphic memoir is not only a relevant but relatable genre through which issues of race, racism, and social injustice during the Second World War can be discussed and digested in an approachable and engaging way to students, staff, and faculty alike. Today's panel takes us beyond They Called Us Enemy and invites us to take a deeper dive into the everyday experiences in the Ruhr concentration camps, into the lives of Japanese American resistors who contested the oppression from the US government, War Relocation Authority, and Cooperative Japanese American Citizens League, and into the issues of identity and meaning-making in the post-war era. By re-remembering the experiences of Japanese Americans during World War II, we can better understand our nation's past, as well as the current climate, and advance our efforts towards racial justice, interracial solidarity, and social change. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelist speakers. leading scholars in Japanese American history and the Asian American experience. Dr. Craig Ihara, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, is the founding coordinator of the Department of Asian American Studies. Born in the Rohr concentration camps, he will discuss the internment experience of his family and others from a personal perspective. Dr. Arthur Hansen. Professor Emeritus of History and former director of the Center for Oral and Public History, will shed light on Japanese American resistance during World War II. He is the author and editor of several books, including the forthcoming Beyond the Betrayal, the memoir of a World War II Japanese American draft resistor of conscience, released this fall from the University of Colorado Press. Dr. Thomas Fujita Roni. Associate Professor of Asian American Studies, has written comprehensively on the intersections of race, gender, and labor among Japanese American concentration camps in Arizona and Hawaii, as well as the redress movement in Seattle and beyond. Today, he will lend insight about Japanese American identity in the post-war era. We are grateful and delighted to have each of the panelists with us today. The format for today will be that each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, immediately followed by questions from the audience. Towards the end of the last talk, we invite audience members to begin to line up at the microphone between the two aisles. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Ihara to speak, who will be followed by Dr. Hansen, who will then be followed by Dr. Fujita Roni. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you all. I'm very grateful to George Takei for writing his book. I mean, I think it's very important today with all of the rising Asian hate crimes that experience the Japanese Americans during World War II be kept in mind, because it's one of the clearest examples of how the government and its citizens had betrayed citizens of the United States. I think I'm going to start off by showing you some photographs from relocation camp. There aren't many. There are a few, and of course, they're not very high quality. But I can show you a little bit about who my family is before I talk about them some more. So this is my mother. She was, in this picture, probably 19 years old. She and my father got married 2 weeks before being sent to Rohr, and that was partly so that she and my father could be together, and the two families could also be together. It was a bit of a rush job, probably not the best thing for them because their marriage didn't last ultimately, but it was lucky for me because I got to be. Anyway, this little grouchy-looking person is me. You will see, perhaps in other photographs too, I never smile. I think I realized I was not being born into a good situation. This is my grandfather, and me playing with his beard, I guess, his stubble. I'll say more about him because, of course, it's the older people who lost the most in the relocation. This is my mother again, and me again, not smiling. You can't tell because I'm wearing a mask, but I do smile more often now. This is my aunt, Amy, my uncle Tosha's wife, and my grandmother, and my aunt Mary, the youngest of the three siblings in the Ihara family. This is my me, my mother, my dad. This must have been something like 1944, maybe 45. My dad is in uniform. He and my uncle both joined the military intelligence service toward the end of the war. I never talked to him about this, but my guess is that, like a lot of the Nisei in the camps, they were not the most gung-ho to go and fight for America. I mean, a lot of people were feeling that why should we go out and fight when our families are being kept in camp, and our homes have been lost, so we don't know what's going to happen to them. But of course, when the call came, when the draft came, I think they decided that the military intelligence service would be a good place to be. Both of them trained at Fort Snelling, which ultimately became the Monterey Language Center, and they were both sent to Japan primarily for the post-war occupation period. I think I've got one or two more. My dad, I'm not quite smiling, but I don't look too unhappy there. This is my Uncle Tosh, a tall Japanese at 5'10". My dad, my Aunt Mary, and her husband Harris, who also was in the MIS by the end of the war. So I think those are the three. I think those are the photos that I wanted to show you. I think I'll leave up this one for a while. So aside from a few of these photographs, and a few comments I've heard from my grandparents and parents about camp. Do you remember Mrs. Shimizu from camp? She was in Block 5. Or do you remember Mr. Nakasone? He just passed away. Or they would make references to people that they knew, sometimes things that they did. What's always struck me, and does still to this day, is that they've had very little in terms of bitter memories. They didn't express a lot of anger or bitterness, maybe regret, because they did lose a lot. Okay? But I always wondered about that, and I think the reason they did that, along with many other things, was for the sake of the children. Kodomo no tamini. They wanted the children not to grow up bitter and angry at the United States. They wanted them to be looking toward the future, to be well educated. They didn't want them to dwell in the past. And I think that explains a lot of the things that went on. That's one of the explanations for why they said very little about the camp experience itself. Another is that for them, being put into camp, being excluded, being regarded as untrustworthy, disloyal, not Americans, not one of us, I think that was a terrible shock to them, the Issei, but especially to the Nisei, because the Nisei, like my mother and father, they were 100% American. They would go out there and they would be jitterbugging their hearts out whenever they could get the chance. And so for them to be regarded as other than a real American was, I think, a real blow to them. And I think it's like a lot of events where someone is shamed or humiliated. I mean, the extreme case would be a case of rape. Someone's raped, completely innocent, right? But they don't want to talk about it. This is something that is too uncomfortable for them to really want to dwell upon. So, truth of the matter is that that growing up, I really did not know very much about the camps, and of course there was very little. There's nothing in the curriculum, even into college. I remember looking for some course on Japanese Americans or on the relocation, and there really was nothing. It's one of the reasons why years later I was so happy to have the opportunity to help start the Asian American Studies program, because this was something that I think could address the immigrant experience, my grandparents' experience, my parents' experience, along with many other Asian groups that came to this country. So, not really knowing very much through college, in the summer of 1967, I decided that I would go down and hitchhike to Rower, Arkansas. In those days, hitchhiking was an adventure. I had lots of adventures hitchhiking there. I can't go into all of that here, but I wanted to just share the idea of what I was feeling as I approached the camp. I mean, I didn't expect to find much, but I still was thinking about how my parents, my grandparents would have felt as they came into Rower. I mean, it's a very flat, cotton growing field area, obviously very impoverished. The only local town was a place called McGee, which I thought about staying in, but it was so depressing, I decided I'd rather sleep on the road. So I continued on, and what I realized is that as they were approaching the camp, they had just gone through 3 or 4 months of really horrendous disruption. My grandfather had been picked up by the FBI in March 14. He had been imprisoned overnight at the county jail, had been sent to another detention camp, Sand Canyon, I'm sorry. It's near Pasadena, and then 2 more months in New Mexico. So the remainder of the family, my grandmother's, my father, his siblings, the head of the household was gone. They had to cope by themselves with all of the prospect of being dislocated, being evacuated. And George Takei's father was not, as far as I can tell, picked up by the FBI. And so at least his immediate family had more of just the normal kind of leadership. But I thought while preparing this just how hard it must have been for my grandmothers and my mother and my father, because they had to figure out a new way of kind of making decisions and moving forward. So my grandfather had come to the United States in 1907. He worked in agriculture for most of his life, had worked himself by the 1940s into a pretty good position of being, I guess you would say, the accountant for or the comptroller for a berry company in the Los Angeles Central Market. And he was doing well. I mean, this is the 30s. Everybody was struggling. But my grandfather was doing relatively well. Just like George Takei's father, who had his own business, they were able to buy their own home, which I think was not that common back in the 30s. My grandfather bought a brand new black Packard that apparently my dad used to like to whiz around town in, showing off the car. He was picked up only because he had some connection with the local Japanese language school. It really wasn't much. I mean, he was on some committee, I think. I mean, the people who were the most high profile in the committee, the one that the government most suspected, were picked up almost immediately after December 7th. But they're gradually working down into other leaders in the community. My grandfather, as far as I can tell, and I've got now, I just this year got a declassified FBI file on his interrogation, 50 pages of documents from my grandfather, from the various investigating officers, from people testifying on his behalf to his good character. And as best as I can tell, he got back, released soon enough to join the family in Santa Anita before they were all shipped out to Rower, Arkansas. Now, it's interesting that George's family, George Takei's family, was in a horse stall. I understand that many people claim to be in horse stalls. You know, Seabiscuit was the most famous horse at the time, and a number of people claim to have been in Seabiscuit's stall. My parents and most people there were not in stalls. There were barracks that were set up. Again, flimsy kind of army barracks, very little privacy, obviously public facilities and such. When I was there, I visited Santa Anita. I was with a group of Nisei vets, and they were explaining how the camp was laid out and how it was run and stuff. And I realized that my parents had been there from roughly May to July. And the trouble is, of course, that when I was born in March, I counted back and realized that I was conceived in Santa Anita racetrack. And I wondered, but I never had the nerve to ask my mother how they managed that under those conditions. I've already been given the 3-minute warning, so I'm going to have to rush ahead to some of this stuff. I think as the people approached the camp and trying to imagine their mindset, I thought most of all of my grandmother, who'd had a very interesting life, worthy of a novel, I think. But my grandmother always said about things, shikata ga nai. Some things you can't do anything about. You shouldn't moan about it. You shouldn't complain. You should just accept the fact and do your best under those circumstances. And I can see her and many of the Japanese Americans in that camp doing just that, saying, look, it's not our fault that we're here, but we really have no choice. The camp, we don't know what it's going to be like. We don't know how long we're going to be there. We don't know what's going to happen to us after the war. We don't know whether we're going to be able to go back to California. Uncertainty is one of the worst things for people to have to deal with. That's what I've found. And they were dealing with an enormous amount of uncertainty. And yet I think they had the attitude, again, for the sake of the children, we have to make the best of the situation. And so they went in there. They relatively quickly took over the necessary work of the camp. They became the cooks. They became the cleaning staff, even the security. They set up schools for the kids, and many of the Nisei were teachers there. There were others that set up sporting events that people could take part in. And so for many kids, especially the younger ones, they were given a good structured environment in what was basically a very strong Japanese American community. They even had dances. And my mother, who loved to dance, and she taught me to love to dance, I asked her once, did you ever get to go to the dances? And she said, no, I had to take care of you. So I don't know if she ever forgave me for that one. But they did their best, and ultimately, unlike George's family, they were able to leave. They wandered in the Midwest for 4 years, ultimately went back to Los Angeles, faced the hostility there, but they were able to reestablish themselves. And so when I went to the Rower camp and saw the cemetery, and I saw the graves of so many old people who had died in the camp, not knowing what was going to happen to their family, I found that really heartbreaking. At least my grandparents got to know and lived to see their children and their grandchildren get reestablished in society. I also realized that the other gravestones I saw, they were very young children. And then I found out recently that the clinic that my mother had me in had only been established 1 month prior. So I was very grateful that, in fact, she had no complications in the birthing process, because otherwise I wouldn't have been here to be able to talk to you today. So, thank you.
I'd like to thank Karen and everyone else who had a hand in staging this particular event, including, of course, George Takei. I have been researching, writing about, and speaking on the topic of the World War II Japanese-American mass eviction and incarceration experience since 1972, nearly a half-century ago. Although during this time I have dealt with a variety of topics within this subject area, my primary concern has been on the resistance mounted by Japanese Americans to their wholesale removal from the West Coast region, some 110 to 120,000 people in all, and their subsequent imprisonment in 10 American-style concentration camps. Euphemistically called relocation centers by the U.S. government, these penal colonies located in remote inland sites in the states of California, Arkansas, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Arizona were administered by the War Relocation Authority, the WRA. Each of these facilities of confinement, for the most part, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guarded by armed military police sentries, were operated by the WRA in unofficial collaboration with the leadership of the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL. For their cooperation, the JACL leaders, comprised of somewhat older, socially conservative, and more prosperous second-generation Nisei, U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry, were elevated in importance within the camps over the Japanese American community's natural leaders, the first generation parental Issei, Japan-born aliens denied the privilege of U.S. naturalization, as well as the Kibei, the U.S.-born Nisei who had received a substantial part of their education in Japan. JACL leaders who characteristically exhibited a strident brand of American super patriotism were selected for the preferred camp jobs, chosen to edit the camp newspapers, and granted other social, political, and economic perquisites. As a result of their integration into the WRA administration, however, JACL leaders came to evaluate their personal status in terms of the successful realization of WRA objectives, which were concerned with social control and social rehabilitation. That is, with developing protective communities where the evicted Japanese American population could be imbued with idealized American principles and practices. The WRA administration-sponsored JACL hierarchy was deeply resented by the Issei and the Kibei, who often were relegated to subordinate and menial jobs. It was bad enough to witness the JACL leadership's usurpation of community authority, but worse to see the invidious purposes for which that authority was used, such as informing to the powers that be on potentially pro-Japan behavior of camp inmates. Nor could the JACL leaders' flaunted U.S. citizenship and unctuousness towards Caucasian WRA authorities have pleased the majority of other camp members of the Nisei generation. The mass extirpation and confinement in concentration camps set in motion by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, permitted these Niseis to reflect upon their past hostility toward the ways of their Japanese Issei parents, the long years of hardships suffered by Issei elders in their behalf, and it caused them to become respectful of the Issei, of their judgment, of their advice, and of their ways. And thus a growing number of Japanized Nisei increasingly viewed the JACL's leaders' behavior as patricidal and treasonable. In every one of the 10 WRA incarceration centers, there manifested during the Second World War a rash of harsh criticisms and even physical beatings of JACL leaders by dissidents who castigated them as Inu, dogs, informers. This situation led to the removal of the JACLers to protective custody within the U.S. mainstream society and their resistors to heavily fortified and guarded WRA-run lockups designated either as isolation center or segregation center. Throughout my 42-year career affiliation with the History Department and the Asian American Studies program, now the Asian American Studies Department at Cal State Fullerton, I produced a series of articles about the resistance movements that manifested within the WRA camps. In 2018, I compiled these articles into a volume entitled Barbed Voices, Oral History, Resistance, and the World War II Japanese-American Social Disaster. That same year, I edited another book for publication, Nisei Naysayer, the memoir of militant Japanese-American journalist Jimmy Omura, one of the fiercest opponents of the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the person branded as the JACL's #1 enemy. James Omura fiercely called out the JACL leaders in his sharp-penned newspaper columns for what he saw as their complicity with the U.S. government's unjust and unconstitutional policies, and most particularly with reference to the federal decision in 1944 to draft imprisoned Nisei into the military without first restoring their lost citizenship rights. It is the draft movement in which James Omura played a pivotal role that I want to highlight in my remarks today. That resistance movement encompassed 8 of the 10 WRA centers and involved some 300 draft resistors, a small number in comparison to the very large number of Nisei who answered the call to the draft in order to quote-unquote prove their loyalty, and who thereafter compiled such a heroic record on the battlefields of Italy, France, and Germany, and where many of them were maimed and killed. The only truly organized draft movement, however, occurred at the Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming, where it was opposed and demonized by the camp's JA-SAIL leaders and the editorial staff of the camp newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel, which characterized the draft resistors as cowardly, un-American draft dodgers. While I cannot go into the complex details of the draft resistance movement at Heart Mountain in the short amount of time that I have today to make my remarks, I do want to tell you about a new book authored by the late Yoshito Koromiyo, 1923 to 2018, one of 63 Heart Mountain draft resistors convicted of draft evasion by a federal district court in Cheyenne, Wyoming on January 26, 1944, and sentenced to a 3-year prison term. Edited by me, it will be published next month by the University Press of Colorado under the title of Beyond the Betrayal, the memoir of a World War II Japanese-American draft resistor of conscience. It's the first book-length account by a Nisei World War II draft resistor and provides an insider's perspective on the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee and the infamous trial condemning the members' efforts to exonerate their actions on constitutional grounds. In the words of one historian, Churston Lyon of Southern Oregon University, Beyond the Betrayal's significance goes beyond the specific stories it tells. It's a timely reminder that each and every individual citizen must ask themselves, what is the citizen's rightful response to constitutional transgressions? What indeed is a citizen's responsibility when racially based restrictions are imposed by an errant government? Two of the contributors to the volume are Eric Muller of the University of North Carolina School of Law, author of the most authoritative historical account of the World War II Japanese-American draft resistance movement, aptly titled Free to Die for Their Country, and renowned Japanese-American poet Lawson Anada. In his lyrical preface, Muller writes, "The past couple of decades have seen the long overdue emergence of a significant literature on the Nisei draft resistance movement in the War Relocation Authority camps of World War II. Nearly all of it, though, has been from the perspective of outsiders to these movements, people like myself who were not present to witness them. What is special about this memoir is that it is a detailed account from within, the penetrating narrative of the draft resistance movement at the Heart Mountain concentration camp in northwest Wyoming from the perspective of a thoughtful and brilliant man who actually participated in it. As for Anada, his foreword to Beyond the Betrayal consists of a stanza poem. From out of the abuses, from out of the cruelties, from out of the losses, from out of the tragedies emerges this lucid voice of this honorable person. Anada's afterword is a long poem dedicated to Yoshito Koromiya that is entitled Drawing the Line. In it, he eulogizes Koromiya with the following stanzas. No, you have no right to imprison my parents. No, you have no right to deny us our liberty. Yes, I have my right to stand for our justice. Yes, I have my right to stand for our freedom. And this is where Yost drew the line. On paper, on the pages of the Constitution, the rest is history. Arrested, judged, sentenced, imprisoned for 3 years for refusing induction under such conditions as long as my family is in here. Eventually arrives a few sentences of presidential pardon, period. But history doesn't rest, as Yost gives testimony, drawing the line on paper again. Thank you.
Okay, that's going to be kind of hard to follow up on, but let's see. So, no, okay. So we could get that first slide. This is the Nishihongganji Temple, right in, at that time was a temple, now it's been repurposed. But this is people being taken away, 1942. It was a community center. It is literally pretty much in the middle of Little Tokyo. Today, it's still there, remembered. I think by many. Get the next slide. And then there's this guy. That's George Takei. I really like George Takei because in 1967 he was on the TV, and my parents said, yes, you can watch. The only other TV we were allowed to watch after dinner, basically, was The Wonderful World of Disney. So this was good. And he was a heroic figure. As my parents rapidly figured out, he wasn't playing the sidekick. He wasn't the evil criminal type. He was actually a relatively fully rounded character. At one point, I remember talking about this with my grandmother, who was an immigrant from Japan. And she said, yeah, but the last name is wrong. I said, oh, so it's not a Japanese name? She said, no. And that ended that one. Turns out she had actually been addicted to soap operas, American soap operas. That was her thing. And so when she saw this, for the first time we were visiting, it was the right day of the week. Then she said, yeah, that's nice. And that was it. But in '67, that was kind of big news. First guy out there talking after camp. So people came back, and I think there's a tendency to sort of jump. 45, as the book talks about George Takei's family's experience, was coming out of camp was not so easy. One, there was a lot of fear. The dad went out first because they didn't know, they really didn't. And once he scoped things out, okay, we can go to Skid Row. And that's where their post-war life as a family really began, in Skid Row, Los Angeles. Time goes on, things get better, they move up economically, buy a house. But I think we have a tendency to say everything was better, partially for economic reasons. That is, people had better jobs, people had more money, people could buy houses, people could support temples. And all this is true, but one of the key foundational facts in there is that in 1960, people looked at the US Census and said, see, we have the numbers. And they were right. And they were dead wrong. Because in 1960, the US Census counted every state of the Union, all 50. And 1950, the decennial census before 60, there weren't 50 states. Alaska and Hawaii joined. And Hawaii was vital to this because in Hawaii, I'm from Hawaii, I grew up in a place where, yeah, the war was horrible, a lot of people died. They bombed us. But then everything was better because in Hawaii, basically that's what happened. The soldiers came back from the war. There was a territory-wide strike in 1946. And after that, that was the beginning of the end of segregated education. My parents went through segregated education. Job segregation, residential segregation. My mom grew up in a dirt floor house owned by the plantation. I didn't do that. I grew up in a nice suburb in a house funded with a GI loan, just like all my cousins did in Hawaii, because in Hawaii you could get those loans. Hawaii was not redlined because basically they looked at the situation and said, okay, the rich people have their stuff and everybody else is undesirable, so you know what, we're just throwing in the towel, we're giving up. But the GI Bill meant, for my uncles, all of whom were war veterans, that, you know, they could get a house in a nice suburb. That's where we all grew up. And so that was the history I knew, that war was bad, but then it was better. And then I went and left Hawaii and went to college in the continental US, and I met people whose families were like Greg's. I said, no, that's kind of not what happened. And it was this huge contradiction for me. How could it be that, because I knew this, I grew up in a place where I'm a second generation professor, for instance. And my dad said, oh yeah, here, this is Fudge. This is my son. Oh, hi. So, and that was Dr. Fujio Matsuda, the president of the University of Hawaii. The governor looked like me, right? The Sears repair guy looked like me. The police looked like me, people looked like me, the teachers looked like me. There was no segregation. All of that was not even mentioned until I was probably high school. And then I found out about what happened in the continental US. And that's what propelled me into studying stuff like reading Dr. Hanson's stuff, for instance, when I was in college and being taken by that, because it was so different. It was so very different than what I knew. The story I learned was Japanese American people, that shikata ga nai, nothing can be done, just bear under it. Yeah, life sucks. Be dignified, get through it. Don't waste energy on that. Do things that matter. Like rebel against your boss and tell him go jump in a lake, which is what a strike is. And that was part of my upbringing. Japanese Americans, when it comes down to justice, you know, there's a break point, and if you go past the break point, well, tough luck for you, and your life will now be a little bit more difficult. So, in that, when I was in graduate school, I thought, okay, so how did this work? And what I discovered was this thing. 1950, really it was the people we've just been talking about, most of whom got incarcerated, or at least a large portion. 1960 was my family, where there are union wages, where you could be an engineer and get an engineer's job, where you could be a lawyer and get a lawyer's job, unlike, for instance, Minoru Yasui, who had to work for the Japanese consulate because nobody would hire a Japanese-American lawyer. Or you could be like my dad, the rebel in the extended family who got a PhD in psychology, which was a rebellious thing. And I thank him for that, because that's why, in the end, I got to become a professor too. But that was the thing. The economics were based on people who rebelled against the authorities, who took that chance and did the kind of things that Dr. Hansen has documented. Except in Hawaii, everybody knew, right? In Hawaii, they knew, oh yeah, this machine is a safeguard, 'cause the union. You don't have a segregated school. The school your cousins went to used to be the segregated school, but not now, 'cause the union. And what is a union? A union is telling the boss, go jump in the lake. So that was part of my upbringing. It was such a contrast for the Japanese American population that people were telling me about, the academic books I was reading, that, oh no, they succeed by not wasting energy, and I agreed with that part, by just gracefully submitting. That if you submit successfully, then you will be successful. And so I went to UCLA to get a degree. I came up with a committee, and the committee said, yeah, go look at that. We're UCLA, we got computers, you can run the numbers. Although I don't do this anymore. At one point in my life, I thought I was going to be a physical oceanographer and work with multivariate calculus and all that kind of stuff. I don't do that anymore. But at that time I did. They had the tapes. They were expensive, but they had them. So I went in and looked at a census sample. And that's what the number said. Japanese Americans in 1960, yeah, you have this very high concentration of white-collar workers. The single biggest concentration was bookkeepers. Bookkeeping is a horrible job because you pay the bookkeeper to make 0 mistakes. And 4 times a year's quarterly report, they get ulcers. The second biggest grouping of high on the socioeconomic scale that is not just money but status were religious leadership. And you know, there's not a whole lot of rich priests. So it turns out the economic miracle people were looking at, they just forgot that. They forgot that, well, there's all these people in Hawaii, high cost of living, unionized jobs, very well integrated into the economy because they're 40% of the population. And you're comparing it to the people who came out of camp with nothing. And if you average those two, as we know, looks pretty good. So post-war then, it wasn't the case that the second generation, the third generation we can make a much better argument for, the kids who benefited from this sacrifice of the 2 generations ahead of them, especially the second generation, the Nisei. They were a sandwich generation because the parents were old and their economic lives had been completely destroyed. And they had kids, and they had to take care of both sets at the same time. So they were the really suck-it-up generation. And especially the older of the second generation did that. It was really the younger second generation and their kids, the third generation, that enjoyed the fruits of that, that became this economic miracle, living in a nice place and all that. But I would caution people about stories like that. When we look at this kind of stuff, what was discrimination like, for instance? Yeah, it got better. It got better partially because in Southern California, for instance, people decided to go and hate on African Americans who were the new population. So I'm going to stop there because we're at time. But thanks a lot. And again, my fellow panelists, I'm here because of them. So I want to say that. And to the sponsors, I really like working at Cal State Fullerton. I was the first tenure-track Asian Americanist hired here as an Asian Americanist. And the university is very consistently, I think, proven worthy of the kind of scholarship that the 2 gentlemen down the table have demonstrated for us. So thanks.
So we'll now open up the floor for audience questions. Please feel free to come up and tell us your name and who you would like to address the question to.
Karen, could I make 2 brief announcements? One is that 20 years ago, I actually interviewed George Takei, and recently I was able to find the video. So I'm hoping that some way or another I can show the video on campus and people would come and see that video. The other is that if you had an interest in seeing more about my family history, I'm installing up in the oral history program a photo history of the family through my generation to generations later. And you might find it interesting to see how the family recuperated from World War II and how the later generations have integrated into the larger society. So that should be, that display, photo display should be up by the beginning of November.
Thank you, Craig. Any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Sherry, why don't you use the mic?
Thank you. Hi, Art.
Hi.
What do you think, how do you think the fate of Japanese American had been different? Would have been different had Japan won the war?
Huh?
I've always wondered that.
I haven't really thought about that. Well, it was a fascist government that we were fighting, and you have to think in contemporary terms, what happens to people from Hong Kong, or what happens from people from Taiwan when they ultimately, are taken over. And we've already seen kind of what's happened in Hong Kong after they got their so-called independence and operated in a democratic way. And now they, had to protest it, and the protesters have been fleeing the country, and there's not much more counterweight. Mm-hmm. And I think you're suborned to the majoritarian society. So, I think it would have been a horrible thing for them. And in fact, a lot of the Japanese Americans would have had a tough time once where they were in. Actually, the Kibe, when they first went to Japan, had a tough time when they went to get educated. They were not, later in the camp, they were considered so pro-Japan and so favored by the Japanese, but they weren't. They were tailed by people. They thought that they might be spies and everything. So, yeah, it could be a sort of a replication of that kind of situation.
Hello, my name is Eddie, and I am a student veteran on campus. So I just had a question for just anyone on the panel. For your generation of Japanese Americans growing up, Was there a stigmatism, or what was the opinion on joining the military or being involved with the military?
You guys can answer that. Your generation of Japanese Americans, I don't think I can answer that.
Well, I don't. I mean, I was never in the military myself. I had friends in high school that went into the military and served with distinction. One was recently inducted into the Army Ranger Hall of Fame. So I do think that, especially during the Vietnam War period, that Nisei or then Sansei soldiers were pretty much welcomed. I had one friend who served his job on the front lines in Vietnam was to go down into the tunnels and to try to ferret out the Viet Cong in the tunnels, which is like the most dangerous imaginable job. But yeah, I think things get better, and the reputation of the 442nd, I think, was broadly spread enough that people recognized that Japanese American soldiers could be outstanding soldiers.
Well, for Hawaii, the veterans came back from the war, the ones who made it back from the war. And a bunch of them went into politics. The congressional delegation for years from Hawaii was composed of World War II Japanese American veterans. And so there's a great deal of status accorded them. People looked up to them. They were leadership. There was also a strong, at the time of the Vietnam War, for instance, in Hawaii, one of the things that went on was that people started getting word from family members that there were kind of a split thing. Sometimes it would be just fine, but a large number of people said, oh yeah, we got labeled as being Vietnamese, that people weren't cognizant, weren't willing to make that distinction. So that's the thing. A video I teach talks about this guy who's badly wounded, so they rip off all the clothing so they can figure out, okay, where's the hole, patch him up. And the rescue helicopter had too much weight. So they said, okay, we start throwing people off. Okay, that guy's Cong, he's Viet Cong, throw him off. And there was this American soldier who didn't look right. And so they're gonna throw him off. African-American soldier intervened, so he didn't, but so there's a mixed kind of thing. I would argue in Hawaii, though, because of the effect of the veterans, if you're a veteran, a lot of people will give you some respect for that. After World War II, which is a really popular war, people were very willing. On the other hand, I had an uncle, really bright guy, he went off, he got scholarship money, he went to school in the continental US. And I remember, this is after many years after I'd graduated and everything, I had a job. And we were talking, my aunt said, oh yeah, your uncle. One day I had to tell him, oh, I'm sorry, but I can't wash your clothing anymore, because as he was walking across the quad, people would spit on him. And he would wear, because he was a veteran, he had the right, the uniform, the Ike jacket, the short, they used to have this very short jacket. And he was a combat veteran, so he had the medals too. And people would just spit on him. And she just couldn't do it anymore, so he couldn't do it. So it wasn't always like that everywhere. All of my uncles actually eventually did some higher education in the continental U.S., and every single one of them came back to Hawaii. The lawyer uncle, for instance, couldn't get hired, so he became his own lawyer. The engineer uncle could get hired, and then he made that point, I did get hired by a big corporation, and then he quit because he made his point and he wasn't willing to suck up anymore. Another engineer uncle very deliberately went into literally sanitation engineering. The guy designed sewers because he knew that, there's not a whole lot of competition, and he was right. He had the last laugh. He became basically the guy in the state of Hawaii that would determine whether or not you could do a project, and there was no recourse because nobody had thought of this. And he basically, there was a struggle, native land struggle in a rural area, and it looked like it was just going to go through. And then my uncle said, but I refuse to authorize the sewage So you can't build unless you want to use chemical toilets. And there is no recourse because you can look at the law. There's no recourse. Sorry. And that ended that. And that was a great satisfaction for him. He was an interpreter. During the war, he spent the war at Camp Smelling, Minnesota, training other people to do his job, basically. So a mixed thing. I think there is a great deal of respect for veterans, but the story of the veterans is not always like that. And personally, a guy who was the brother of my high school basketball coach went into the Marine Corps, and basically they treated him like dirt. And this was recent, by the way. Finally got it appealed and was commissioned as I guess a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, but never got activated. He got commissioned to the reserves and never served as a Marine officer. But that was recent. That was in the 90s, I believe, that Bruce Yamashita went through that. So it doesn't go away. And he said the same thing. Hey, it's an honorable job. You know, I want to be in the military. And at that point, the Marine Corps was really not ready to have a Japanese American officer in their ranks. So.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Fontaine from the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. First, thank you. Thank you for your stories today. I'm struck, Dr. Hansen, you said that this is the first memoir of its kind. And you said, Dr. Hard, that there haven't been, that individuals who were in the camps didn't tell the stories, that they just, remembered them. And I'm wondering, is that changing? With every passing day, we lose the opportunity for people to tell their stories. And are there more of them that are out? I'm thinking George Takei's book is relatively recent. Is this something that we hope we can capture before it's too late? Thank you.
I think the narrative of the World War II Japanese American story has shifted, appreciably since the turn of the century. And that more and more books and articles and the like, exhibits. Right now, for example, at Cal State Fullerton out in the Arboretum, there's an exhibit on the Thule Lake Camp. And the Thule Lake Camp was a segregation center, ultimately. So-called no-no boys and their families, and also people who renounced their U.S. citizenship. Here's something that now people who were at Thule Lake never wanted to tell anybody that were at Thule Lake for fear that it would hurt their family's reputation and the like, and even their livelihood. But now there's a book being written about the Thule Lake experience by a Japanese American, Barbara Takei, with a historian that's even older than me, Roger Daniels. So that shall be out, and it will make, I think, an appreciable difference. But there's also right now another graphic novel out, and this is by Frank Abe, and it deals with resistors, Japanese American resistors of different types during World War II. So yes, the story is getting out there, and of course, with all the Black Lives Matter and other groups' lives that matter being such a front and center issue right now in our society, I think this narrative will continue to be, this counter narrative will be continued to develop. One thing I just wanted to say, dealing with the remarks that I've got a mainlander, Japanese American, and one from the islands here, and the dramatic difference between the experiences between those two. The Japanese American story, not just the war time period, but the whole Japanese American story has to be more encompassing. For a long time, people didn't know on the mainland much about what was going on in Hawaii. This is a majority population. Here it's a minority population. There are powers and preferences and everything else that you get from being a majority. And here you had a person that was in the 442nd that became 3 heartbeats away from becoming the President of the United States, in Senator Daniel Inouye, so yeah, there's a big difference between those two places, but the whole story has to be told. It shouldn't be just isolated on the mainland community, and even there it's too isolated on just the West Coast part. Most of the Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast. You have to deal with the other parts of of the Japanese experience. And historians have called for this sort of change to happen. And I think it will be a refreshing thing to happen too, because in those places, they were even more of a dramatic minority. They had no representation, no socialization, groups, et cetera, to be able to plug into their own heritage, their own ancestry.
Yeah, and not to mention the Japanese living in South America, or the ones in Canada, where there were also internment camps. And the Peruvians, one of the things that really surprised me was when I found out that something like 1,000, 2,000 Peruvian Japanese were sent up to Crystal City, Texas, to be incarcerated during World War II. And that's another incredible story.
In that connection, I should mention the fact that the Japanese American National Museum, sorry, I got to get this mask on again and play the Lone Ranger one more time. The Japanese American National Museum has a site called Discover Nikkei, and it's a site that is in 4 different languages, reflective of the kinds of concerns that it's in Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, and English and everything, and it's just full of stories that really has a global sort of reach to it. That's when it's called Discover Nikkei. Nikkei is the term for all people of Japanese ancestry. So its reach is very, very broad and deep.
Just another one. Dean Fontaine asked, okay, so are we preserving this? And we got lucky. There's one of the early vice presidents, I think he was, at Microsoft, got to retire early with a pile of money. And he said, here, have some money. I know about computers. How about you go and videotape people? And that was the beginning of the Densho project. It's at densho.org is their web presence. And they have these wonderful, in-depth, like hours and hours and hours of the stories that you've been hearing about today. Not just the brave soldiers, they got those too. Or the people who just stoically stuck it out, they got that too. But they also have made a real investment in getting the other stories, other people's stories, other places. And as one of my students pointed out, it's not about Japanese Americans are really nice and great. It's about this is a horrible thing, and we want to educate people about it so it doesn't happen again. One of the key pieces in there is language, how we talk about people. And there's a great essay in there, Words Can Lie or Clarify, by Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, was a local person. She grew up in Los Angeles. She was one of these people. She married right then because they were going to split up, her and her beloved. Went through camp. First kid was born there. Really bad nutrition. Didn't really thrive, but survived. Had her life, retired, and out of nowhere, this American soldier, a paratrooper from New Jersey, had seen her earlier, thought, wow, she's nice, but she's married, so. But he was an MP. He was a spy catcher. He was in the Corps of Military Police, so he tracked her down. Figured out she was divorced, showed up with flowers, swept her off her feet. They had a great romance. And then he said, retire. I got a lieutenant colonel's pay. And so they did that, and she got bored out of her mind. He was working in D.C. when they blew up the Pentagon. The emergency plan that went in was Lieutenant Colonel Herzig's plan. That's what he was doing after he retired from the Army. And she's the person who basically discovered all the dirt, because she was living at the National Archives for like 60 hours a week. And she was a secretary, and it was messy, and it drove her nuts. So basically, when I went to the National Archives in the 80s, and I talked to an archivist, she said, oh, you know, I don't know that much, but this person does. They're in the phone book. And I thought, really? And so I went over, met her. She's a very generous person, her and her husband, Jack. And that's a story of resistance. She just decided, you know what, I'm not going to give up because this is dirty. Nobody could find the evidence. By the way, Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga was denied a high school. She was an honor student. War came, and her principal said, you don't deserve a diploma, you're not getting one. And so she didn't. She had a GED. But that little old lady with a GED was the one that discovered the evidence that resulted in billions of dollars of restitution years later. And inarguable proof was a little old lady from Los Angeles who never got to graduate high school. And it's that kind of spirit, I think, that we really need to think about, because she was very definitely, that's her essay about words can lie or clarify. She was right in the middle. We have these great pictures of her marching in New York City for Puerto Ricans, for African Americans, and for Japanese Americans later. But that's the legacy I'd like to see more of. Not just preserving these stories, as Dean Fontaine has talked about, that's very important, but also what were these connections? You know, what did it mean to grow up in a segregated Los Angeles? What did it mean to grow up in Boyle Heights, which is where my mother-in-law, by the way, is living now, in a retirement home? And you know what? Guess what, folks? She kind of looks like me. So in some ways, she doesn't quite fit in, except she does, because she knows Japanese, because she's from Indonesia and she was forced to learn it by the Imperial Japanese Navy so she could entertain the troops during World War II. And that kind of interconnection, I think, is something we could use more of today in this time and place, about just what does it mean about civil liberties in time of war? What does it mean to be able to use a person's experience? Like Fred Korematsu, one of the Supreme Court plaintiffs during World War II, he lost. But later on, because of Aiko and Professor Peter Irons, who found some other legal evidence, he was a lawyer, they got a judge to say, oh yeah, Supreme Court was wrong. First time ever in U.S. history was Korematsu versus the United States, where a Supreme Court decision, and it's the Supreme Court, but it turns out there's this one little loophole. If you can prove they lied about facts knowingly, then you can go back and revisit, and that's Korematsu versus the U.S. And the reason he won that case was this little old lady with a GED found the stuff. And that's the kind of legacy, I think. Somebody like that who thought broadly and who didn't give up and retained her dignity, that we should remember. So,
I'd like to say editorially that Aiko Herzig was probably the central figure in the most important resistance movement in all of Japanese American history, and that was the World War II redress movement. And I'd like to say in the same connection that when you go home, get on the computer and look up Thomas Fujita Roni and look up Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, and you'll read one of the most brilliant essays ever written in Japanese American history. It's a masterpiece and everything, like everything that Tom has written. So that would be my recommendation to you.
Thank you all for your rich insights and this rich conversation. I wish we could continue and continue this conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time today. But on behalf of the Asian American Pacific Islander Faculty and Staff Association, the One Book Club, One Book, One CSUF Committee, and the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, Equity, and Programs, I'd like to thank everyone who has shared today on our panel. I'd also like to thank our audiences, both virtual and those in person, for being here, for your presence, and for your participation. And for those who are still desiring a copy of the They Called Us Enemy book, we do have copies outside in the lobby that you are welcome to take home with you and to enjoy and continue these conversations within your social networks here on campus. So thank you for your attendance, and thank you again to our panel.